Hi everyone! Today on Tim Talks, I'm talking to Carter Sickels, the author of The Prettiest Star. It's my favorite book of the year so far, and just congratulations on publication, Carter.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. I'm really excited to talk with you.
So how are you doing under these circumstances, and what's it like publishing a book right now?
It's a little strange. It's a little surreal, and I think a couple of months ago, I was still hoping maybe some of the book tour would pan out, and then each week another bookstore was canceled, until I finally had to accept, okay, the book tour is not happening, at least not in a physical space. And it's actually been, I feel really grateful for my publishers, my publicist, my agent, really trying to get the book out there, and from readers. And I feel like although I miss going to a bookstore and signing copies and talking with readers, I'm still getting responses and messages from people. And I don't know, I think it's been really great to see how the writing and the book community has kind of come together through this,
Because you pushed publication back a few weeks, right?
We did about a month.
Oh, okay.
Because things were still, it was supposed to come out in April, and it was just seemed so uncertain. We had no idea what was happening, so we pushed it back to May.
Yeah. Other than the book, how have you been doing?
I'm good. I feel, I'm healthy. I feel safe. I still have my job, so yeah. I'm doing fine. I'm just sort of adjusting to life under quarantine, and I see my husband and my dog, and that's kind of it. Unless it's on a screen.
Yes, right? Exactly. Yeah. So I wanted to start, you write the prettiest sentences, and I don't know if you've ever been told that, but I just, after every sentence, I literally stopped and I said, that's just such a well-crafted sentence. And so while this question may be odd, I want to know, how do you sit down and write a sentence? Not just a book, but just a sentence.
Well, thank you. That is very meaningful for me to hear, because I do spend a lot of time crafting the sentence. One thing I do is just from reading, like other books are my teachers. So I'm always sort of paying attention to how a writer uses words and creates a sentence, the sound of a sentence, the rhythm of a sentence, particular words. And I read a lot of poetry too, so I think that helps inform my ear. But I also read everything aloud that I write. So when I'm composing a sentence, I'm trying to get it out there in the first draft. When I'm going back and revising, I read everything out loud and think about how it sounds, and also that it's accurate for that particular character who's speaking. So that I don't have.
You read so many books, and I think you can put the book down and say, "Oh, that was a great book." But it's every once in a while that you're like, "Wow, that was a really good sentence," or so. Thank you for that. So why don't you tell readers what The Prettiest Star is all about?
Sure. So the book takes place in 1986, and it follows Brian Jackson, who's a young gay man living in New York City, and he's just been diagnosed with AIDS. And he's lost his boyfriend and many of his friends to AIDS. And so he decides to return back to his small town in Ohio, where he grew up. And the novel follows him, and then it also follows his mother, Sharon, and his little sister, Jess, who hasn't seen Brian since she was 14. And so the novel is I think it's doing a couple of things. It's looking at the AIDS epidemic, but through the lens of like small town America. And it's looking at kind of how this family will either take Brian in or not, and how they will either evolve or fail, or maybe both of those things.
So the title comes from the David Bowie song, correct? The Prettiest Star?
Does, yes.
And I I mean, horrible gay man here, but I didn't know that song, so I looked it up and I looked the lyrics, and lyrics are beautiful. And so it comes from the phrase, one day, though it may as well be someday, you and I will rise up all the way, and all because of what you are, the prettiest star. I wanted to ask, do you know David Bowie's intent on writing the song? And then why did you feel to use it for your title?
I did some research later, and I found out I think he was like proposing to his girlfriend or something when he wrote the song, but I didn't know that at the time. You're not a terrible gay man. I didn't know this song either.
Okay, good.
Bowie was becoming more and more of a presence in the novel because I felt that Brian would have loved David Bowie. You know, he was growing up in a small town in the 70s, and here was this sort of like creature who really broke down the gender binary, was really open about sexuality and without the shame. And so I think he was just kind of this figure for Brian that sort of symbolized another way of life was possible. And so he became sort of present in the novel. And I didn't have a title when I was starting, or I had a few throwaway titles. It takes me a while to land on one. And so I started thinking about Bowie's presence in the novel, and I made a list of songs that I had been listening to, or songs that that came up in the book. And my husband actually is the one that chose The Prettiest Star, because he knows much more of Bowie's music than I did when I started this. And so I chose it. It felt sort of perfect for the novel. I liked that it was one of his lesser known songs. Mm-hmm. And I think I don't know, it's such, the lyrics are so poignant, and I looked them up later, and it just sort of, I felt really connected to the story I was trying to tell and to Brian.
Well, I think what I loved about it is it's not just the love. You know, I think Bowie probably meant it as a romantic love, but you can also read it as familial love, and from the mother, from the father, from the sister. And so that's why I thought it was so poignant. Thank you. So I've read many novels about the AIDS epidemic. I would say even in the last 4 years, I feel like a lot are creeping up in mainstream fiction. And for me, it's so important because it is a time I lived through, but not in the big city. I mean, I had never been to New York. I had never, so the AIDS epidemic, while I was born in 83, was around. I definitely knew it from this rural community that was pretty homophobic. I mean, I remember you're so gay, or faggot, or don't touch, you'll get AIDS. And you really poke in that in the book. So I wanted you, how did you examine this intense homophobia in this rural community? And then what do you think the main reason for it is in society?
Well, I examined it kind of from similar to you, sort of my own memories of growing up in a small town and in the 80s, and just remembering the really intense kind of homophobia. What I remember about AIDS was sort of the jokes about it, don't touch me, you'll give me AIDS, as you said. And that was it. I mean, I didn't know anyone who was gay or trans when I was a kid. Like, nobody was out in my high school. So a lot of that homophobia I was able to access just from my own kind of memories. And I wanted to tell an AIDS story that was kind of looking at it from a different lens. Like you said, so many of us move from small towns to cities, and there's just such a queer exodus to cities. But sometimes queer people stay in rural areas, or sometimes people like Brian had to go back for different circumstances. And so I thought it would be really interesting to kind of look at that intersection between rural and queer kind of experience and tell that story. And I think too, because I didn't see that representation when I was growing up, I felt really hungry for that. And so I wanted to try to put something into the world that spoke to a small town, but also a queer experience, and be really honest about the homophobia. in that area during that time. I don't have the answer to the second part of your question, but so I would love to hear what you think too. I mean, I think part of it is just from patriarchy and misogyny, the kind of society that, you know, that we live in. And there's just so much, there's such a strong narrative around shame with queer people. And I think that, you know, ties into
it's fear of the unknown a little bit. And that creates, I think then that loses anyone's compassion and understanding for some reason. And don't know why, but
and that fear often turns into the hate or into violence.
Yeah. So in the acknowledgments, you say the seed of this book was planted almost 30 years ago when a gay man, Mike Sisco, had AIDS and was living in a very small town, and he took a swim. So can you tell me a bit about him? Did you do a lot of research?
I did, but my first sort of memory of him was watching the Oprah Winfrey Show when I was a kid. And she went to West Virginia. She went to this small town in West Virginia and did a sort of a town hall because this man, Mike Sisco, who I think he was living in Dallas. He'd gone back to his hometown in West Virginia, and he was HIV positive, and he went swimming in the swimming pool. And as soon as he got in, everyone else got out. They barred him from coming back. The mayor cleaned the pool, disinfected it. And so Oprah took her show there, and the members of the audience were members of his community. It was all people who lived in this small town. And, you know, I don't remember exactly what I felt when I watched that show, but it certainly stuck with me. And I went back as I was working on this to see if that had really happened and to do the research on it. And you can still watch a few clips of the Oprah show, and it's really devastating. I mean, he's there. Mike is there on stage, and there's this man who stands up and says, you know, AIDS is going to eradicate all gay men, and everyone in the audience just claps. I mean, there's all this applause. And so just the ugliness of that, I think, really sort of stuck with me when I was a kid before I understood my own like gender and sexuality, sort of planted that seed.
Let them find somewhere else to go. I mean, heck, they can buy an island in ice somewhere, I'm sure. Let them all go there. But I think God has given them the AIDS for a special reason. I think that's God telling them, hey, this is no good.
I don't even know if I want to watch that. But I mean, that's how I felt in the book a lot too, that it's just, you know, you're reading fiction, and yes, we've come a long way, and, you know, we're both happily married, and we're, you know, and able to walk down the street hand in hand, but there are still a lot of places in the world that you can't do that, and we still have a long way to go. So as a gay man who has a very special bond with his mother, I read the Sharon chapters with a little bit of contempt for her, because I felt, why aren't you, it's your son. Like, that is, do you not know what unconditional love is? I always try to, I always want to see another side to someone and really try to understand where they're coming from, because, you know, just like politically, I feel so passionately about something, but the other side feels so passionately about their side too. So I really wanted to do that, but it was really difficult for me. When you were writing the Sharon chapters, were you able to relate at all to her and understand where she was coming from?
I think so. So yeah, I mean, of course, her worldview is very, very different from mine. But I think part of being a fiction writer is stepping into these shoes of other characters and other people who live very different lives from you and have different viewpoints. And I think that's one of the beauties of fiction, is that it can make us feel empathetic toward people who maybe we thought we couldn't. So I really wanted to write Sharon from like this place of tenderness and compassion, but I also didn't want to let her off the hook, and for readers to feel very angry or frustrated with her, because she does love her son, but she doesn't, you're right, like love him unconditionally, because she's too afraid of what the neighbors will say or what her church will say. And we see her through the book getting to a better place and making very small steps, but then having setbacks as well. And I think I hope that she's a character that comes across with compassion, but also very flawed. And I guess I just didn't want it to be too easy for his homecoming. I wanted that kind of conflict and tension to be there.
I think it was almost like the suspense for me of this book was seeing how what Sharon would do, and if at the end I would be able to decide if I liked her or not.
Right.
So I won't give anything away if I didn't.
Right.
Reading this book right now with what we're dealing with COVID-19, I could not help but put so many parallels in, because I live on Nantucket Island, which a lot of people think of as this big tourist place, but it really is in and of itself a small community. And there's a Nantucket Facebook page that is constantly like, did you see someone's not wearing a mask? Did you see them, walking in the store without, there's a lot of judgment. There's a lot of fear in this COVID-19 pandemic right now. So I really kind of wanted to discuss the parallels between the AIDS epidemic and kind of almost like you just had said, like, we hopefully have learned, but I think as humans, we constantly repeat bad history. Like, we constantly repeat ourselves. So I just wanted to talk about those parallels, and if you see any from the book you wrote too right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's very sort of surreal to have this book come out now about a pandemic that is now we're experiencing, this global pandemic, which of course I had no idea this would happen while I was working on this book. And I don't know, there's been a lot of conversation about the parallels and the differences. And I think obviously they're very different diseases, and I don't want to minimize or make kind of easy parallels between them either, because I think the stigma that people felt, especially during the 80s and 90s, was just, it's almost incomprehensible, like for gay men who were dying of AIDS, and the response from families, from the media, from hospitals, from the government. And so I think in that way it's very different. I mean, I think Reagan hadn't even said the word AIDS until like 40,000 people had died. And so there was just this level of people just not really caring, because they felt that gay men or drug addicts or people of color were expendable. So I think they're very different. But I think that certainly a lot of the fear and the miscommunication and the lack of government response, there's some things that we can draw parallels between. And I don't know, for me, I'm also like, with my book specifically and thinking about what happened in the 80s, like I hope that we can look at the queer community and how they took care of each other. And so I think that's one of the questions my book is asking, is like, what kind of society do we want to be, and how can we take care of each other and show each other compassion? And so that's something I'm kind of drawing on for myself.
I obviously don't know your coming out story, but would you have been able to go back to a community that rejected you?
Well, I think that I wanted to show with Brian, because I think that it's often portrayed kind of simplistically about coming out. Like, some people have a really positive experience, some people are disowned, but I think there's a big kind of gray area between that, which has been more my experience. So family who says they love you, but yet cannot fully support you or accept you or see you for who you are. And so that was really what I was kind of thinking about, is the different levels of familial homophobia. And then it doesn't just mean that somebody is kicked out of their home or disowned, and that families can be more sort of loving on one hand, but also sort of manipulative in the other, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like,
yeah,
kind of the don't ask, don't tell.
Yeah. Very similar situation for myself. I mean, it's It's okay. So Jess and her friend Nick asked the very profound question on page 114. What if you found out you were dying? What would your last wish be? And I kind of wanted to know, if it's not too private, what yours would be. And then do you think it would be different if you actually were dying?
I don't know if I can answer that. And really, because I don't know. It probably would be different, right? If you're dying, like it's so hard to know what that would feel like. But I think my wish would just to have my friends, my husband, my family with me, around me, and to maybe be in a beautiful place on the ocean. uh, but yeah, I don't know. It seems like you would want to sort of reconcile and feel loved and seen. I don't know. What do you think about that?
I mean, I think why I tagged on that second part of the question is that I feel that you don't really know how it feels to know that you're going to die. Like, I recently lost my sister to cancer, and, she knew it. And I don't think anyone could really get in her head to know what she was feeling. I think we all tried, and I think you can try to. Yeah. So I guess that's why I wanted to know the question, but then at the same time, like, if that would really even be what it was.
Yeah. I was thinking too, I mean, I don't think it gives anything away that Brian is going home to die. And so I was thinking about your question and that part with Jess. And I also think it's like, because Jess is so young and she can't really comprehend what death will look like. So can be kind of this fantasy, right? Like, what would your dying wish be? But in reality, the death is, it's a very physical experience, and I'm sure there's the physical pain, there's just the immediacy of wanting to feel cold or to feel hot, those very kind of elemental and physical desires that you're probably also experiencing in that moment.
Yeah. Do you think the AIDS epidemic helped or inhibited public opinion on homosexuality progressing for us? And I guess what I mean by that is, AIDS was thought to be the gay disease, and obviously it was intense homophobia from the 80s and 90s, like we've talked about. But without that, do you think we would be where we are now, or would we be farther along if AIDS had never happened?
I mean, I think it's an impossible question to answer, really, knowing one way or the other. I mean, but it does seem that AIDS epidemic, I mean, because there was this urgency that queer people had to really be visible and come out of the closet, and that straight society had to sort of see that and engage with that. And of course, there was a reason for so much of that homophobia. But I also want to just, give thanks to all of the activists, the AIDS activists and the LGBT activists during that time, because I do feel like they made such significant changes for all of us, for me, to live my life the way I can and to be open. So I think that, I don't know if AIDS had to happen, but I do think that the activism and the community response to AIDS made our lives easier or better.
So sex and death are two mysteries of the human existence, I think, because they're kind of the least talked about in society. And AIDS is kind of wrapped up in sex and death in a lot of ways. And so what do you think is so shameful for sex in society that it's not something that we can really talk about?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point, that I think both of those topics are so, there's just so much fear around them or shame around them. And there's a sort of still like puritanical attitude in America that we can't talk openly about sex. We're afraid of death and we can't talk about that. And so I think you're right that the AIDS was something that sort of brought those two sort of unspoken topics together. And I have a part in the book with Brian saying that, it wasn't just sex. It was like queer sex or gay sex. Like people did not want to talk about that. And so that kind of snowballed this idea of that AIDS was something shameful because they viewed gay sex as shameful, as two men having sex or two men loving each other as something that was wrong. I mean, I think so much of it comes back to the heavy influence of religion and Christianity. But
so after writing it, what are your takeaways from this time in history? And I guess, did you think that did it change at all from when you originally sat down to write it?
I mean, I had my own memories, and I remembered how AIDS felt like this sort of scary thing when I was a kid, but I didn't quite understand it. I remember, as we talked about, the homophobia and the jokes. And I remember it being very much a part of my entire existence in some way of growing up. I mean, in the 80s and 90s, AIDS was always sort of there, of this thing to be afraid of. But I didn't experience a lot of the pain and loneliness and death that people who were front and center, who were a little older than I was, were dealing with. And so I think, although I knew about it, really delving into the research part of this book and watching so many incredible documentaries about the AIDS epidemic, and reading so many books on it, just getting a sense of how horrific it really was. Like, to imagine myself, at that age in my 20s and losing people every week, like going to funerals every week, and how just abandoned I think so many people felt by the country, by the government, by their families. And so, yeah, I think it really just, I don't know, made me empathize even more than I did before, and just really grasp how people felt like their entire life, their entire community was kind of under siege and they had nowhere to turn to, but they were able to kind of lift each other up and take care of each other.
Yeah. That's what, with reading them lately, for me, is just like, that could have very easily been me. It could have very easily been my friends. That could have easily happened to me. So I think it's that feeling of, thankful that it wasn't, but then at the same time to really have to be able to honor these people that did go through that. And your book does that.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so my favorite thing to do with authors is the speed round. And it's when I ask you some of your favorite things. So are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. Favorite book as a kid?
Let's say The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton.
Favorite novel?
So I think my favorite novel is, I have many, but Moby Dick.
That's the second author that I've interviewed in this series. Ruthie Thorpe said the same thing. And Nathaniel Philbrick, who wrote In the Heart of the Sea, which is kind of the true story on Moby Dick, wrote a whole book on why read Moby Dick. And I just can't. I can't get into that book.
I never wanted to. I was like, why do I want to read this? Why would I ever want to read this book? And then I did, maybe about 10 or 15 years ago, and it would just kind of blew me away. It's very,
so
very
I have
funny art, and it's queer, and it's just, yeah, it's incredible.
I have like 5 copies of it in my house because we live out in Nantucket, so I have it all like displayed, but I have not. I've tried to read it, but I just can't get through that first chapter of The Waves. And Nat Philbrick said that I just need to like read one chapter at a time and not think I'm just going to sit down one time and just read Moby Dick all the way through. But
right, yeah, you have to be at the right place and time in your life, I think. But,
yeah. Favorite nonfiction?
I'm going to say The Argonauts by Maggie Nelson, which was out a few years ago.
Yeah. Favorite literary quote?
I'm really bad at memorizing quotes, but I love the quote by Joan Didion. We tell ourselves stories in order to live, which is from her essay, The White Album. Yeah.
Favorite novel with LGBT characters?
There's so many, but one of my favorite books is Mysterious Skin by Scott Heim, which came out in the 90s.
Oh, I've never heard of it. I will be looking that up.
Oh, you should check it out. It's also a film, but it's a great book.
Book that made you laugh the loudest?
I feel like many of the books I read are sad or dark, so I was really thinking like, what has made me laugh? But my friend Robert Geip, who lives in Kentucky, wrote a book called Trampoline that I love, and there it is. Also has moments of heartbreak, but a lot of humor.
Yeah, I hardly ever cry in a book. I hardly ever laugh out loud in a book, but I can cry. So that's the next question. Book that made you cry the hardest?
Yeah, I haven't like sobbed, but I did shed some tears with The Friend by Sigrid Nunez that was out 2 years ago.
Yep.
Yeah, which I just found beautiful, and I don't know, something about the dog and the death of the dog was.
Yeah, that's a lot.
Yeah.
Book that you've read multiple times?
Beloved by Toni Morrison, I've read several times, which is also one of my favorite books.
Is there a book you wish you had written?
I think that I sort of wished I'd written, it's not a book, it's a short story, is Brokeback Mountain by Annie Proulx.
Mm-hmm.
I love the rural, the gay cowboys.
Yeah, I love that. Okay, this is just for fun. Your stage name, which is your first pet and the street you grew up on.
This is funny. Well, I had a little beagle, and her name, when I was very, very little, whose name was Babe, which is already pretty great. So it would be Babe Broadwind.
Wow, I like it.
Oh, good, right?
If you ever have to write and have to have a synonym, you can use that. What are you reading right now?
I'm reading a novel, Leading Men, by Christopher Castellani.
Yeah.
Have you read that?
Yeah, I loved it. He was coming for the book festival this year. Obviously, it was canceled, but he was coming for the book festival. Yeah, it's great.
It's so good. I'm about halfway through, but yeah, I love it.
Are you writing anything right now?
I've just been working on a few short stories and essays and kind of revising some materials, but I've been so sort of focused on the book launch that I haven't had a lot of time to write these past few weeks. But.
And your first book is it called The Evening Hour?
Yeah, my first book is called The Evening Hour. What
was that about? I've been so enamored with this one that I haven't even gotten a chance to look that one up. Can you tell me a bit about that one?
Yeah, it's very different. It's about a guy living in a small town in West Virginia, and he's just kind of he's sort of stuck in his life. He's in his 20s, and it's really looking at this kind of rural place and class and issues of masculinity, and their opioid epidemic in Appalachia, and
Well, I can't wait to pick it up. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, and you're so gracious because you're going to come back, and when I announce the book club on June 1st, then you'll come back on June 25th, and we can talk to all the people that sign up for that and get their questions and just kind of have a group discussion, which I think this book really warrants. So thank you for taking this hour, and thank you again for the June 25th thing that you'll do.
Yeah, I'm excited. Thanks so much, Tim.
Take care. Have a good night. The Prettiest Star is Tim Talk's Book of the Month for June 2020. Purchase a copy at nantucketbookpartners.com and join the conversation with the author on June 25th at 5 p.m. I'll email you the Zoom link for the discussion with purchase of the copy.